So here we begin with part two of this series that touches on Bears Ears National Monument and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. Here we're going to look at essential questions of the past, the present, and the future. So this is going to give you some better context as to what we're talking about in regards to these two national monuments. In the past, dinosaurs once roamed the land, and especially in Grand Staircase Escalante, you have some of the most remarkable remains of dinosaur fossils found anywhere on the earth. One of the museums that represents this past history, one of these museums shows vividly the different kinds of species of dinosaur that once roamed this area. And in fact, you can actually see dinosaur tracks and so on as evidence of this period in history. The other thing is that there were native peoples who occupied the land for thousands of years. And so that past, as I had already alluded to, in terms of the cliff dwellings, the kivas, the granaries, the pictographs and petroglyphs on the canyon walls, all of this encompasses opportunities for people to study, learn about, and research that past of Native American Indians. There were also explorers who came into this region, and this makes up part of our national history as well. And so European Americans came west in covered wagons, and primarily when we're looking at this area of Utah, these would have been the Mormons or the Latter-day Saints. So this is part of our American history as well. Now, one other aspect of the past that I want to touch on has to do with what is probably to most people a rather obscure act back from 1906, more than 100 years ago. That would be the Antiquities Act. Now, I'm going to put up a bit of a large excerpt from the Act. Here you can see it before you. And rather than you thinking that all of a sudden the sound has gone dead, I'm going to go ahead and read this, although I wouldn't normally do that. I understand that you might think there's a problem with the audio if all of a sudden things go quiet. So let me read this to you. And then we're going to pay particular attention to those sections that are in bold, okay? You see that? Here we go. That the President of the United States is hereby authorized, in his discretion, to declare by public proclamation historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest that are situated upon the lands owned or controlled by the government of the United States to be national monuments, and may reserve, as a part thereof, parcels of land, the limits of which in all cases shall be confined to the smallest area compatible with proper care and management of the objects to be protected. And there you have the longest sentence in the history of the universe. Now, note the sections in bold. So, first of all, President of the United States. Here we find that the president is authorized to do this, to proclaim objects of historic or scientific interest. Again, the section that is in bold. This can only occur, of course, on lands owned or controlled by the government, so we're not talking about private lands, okay? And then these will be set aside as national monuments, again in bold, to be protected. The last three words, to be protected. So, let's see how that has played out in American history. Well, just about every president, as it turns out, has used the Antiquities Act, beginning with Theodore Roosevelt, the first president that was able to do so, given the time frame. So, just about every president, Democrat and Republican, in the course of our history since Theodore Roosevelt has made utilization of the Antiquities Act. In other words, to set aside national monuments. So this is nothing unusual at all. Theodore Roosevelt did it. Again, he was the first one, but because the act only goes back to 1906. President Theodore Roosevelt was the first one to make application of the Antiquities Act. And among other parks, remember, he worked closely with John Muir. We've talked about that previously in class. Among other parks was, or monuments, I should say, was Grand Canyon, which was initially dedicated by presidential proclamation as Grand Canyon National Monument. Then you can see, and this is for our purposes, I'm not listing all of the national monuments, it would go on for a good long time, but for our purposes, the ones that we're interested in here are Grand Staircase Escalante, set aside way back in 1996 by President Clinton, and then President Obama, right near the end of his term in 2016, setting aside Bears Ears National Monument. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the past, the dinosaurs, the American history, the Native American Indians, the Antiquities Act, and how these places are set aside in the first place. And now let's move to the present. Well, what happened is that upon taking the presidency, our current president reduced the boundaries of two national monuments, the two national monuments in question, Grand Staircase Escalante and Bears Ears. So, how could that possibly happen? Remarkably enough, let's go back to the Antiquities Act. Remarkably enough, and now all you have to do is look at the bold at the very bottom, smallest area compatible with proper care and management. The very language of the Antiquities Act that is used to set aside national monument was used in this case to shrink national monuments. So it's actually pretty fascinating. It's pretty remarkable how all of this came about. So that's what's going on in the present. So Bears Ears was reduced by about 1.1 million acres, and Grand Staircase Escalante was reduced by approximately 800,000 acres. And I'll have some maps for you in just a moment. So we've looked at the past. We've looked at the present. What about the future? Well, people are concerned that the lands that were taken away from national monument status might be used in the production of oil, coal, uranium. There was a public comments period about this to see what the American public felt, and you can see this was a pretty big issue. Of 2.8 million public comments, more than 95% were in favor of protecting national monuments. 95%. So, nonetheless, the borders were reduced. Bears Ears by 85%, again 1.1 million acres, and Grand Staircase Escalante by 46%. That was 800,000 acres in reductions. As it turns out, there was an enormous outcry over all of this, led primarily by the outdoor recreation industry. And that included Patagonia, who on its website, this was the title page of their website, "The President Stole Your Land." In an illegal move, the president just reduced the size of Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante national monuments. This is the largest elimination of protected land in American history. And all of that is true. Patagonia went on to explain why they were jumping into the fray, why Patagonia is in the fight to protect public lands, and they explained themselves by quoting Teddy Roosevelt. "We have fallen heirs to the most glorious heritage a people ever received, and each one must do his part if we wish to show that the nation is worthy of its good fortune. Each one must do his or her part if we wish to show that the nation is worthy of its good fortune. Each one must do his or her part. Teddy Roosevelt. So let's take a look at those maps. Bears Ears National Monument, which has the highest density of cultural resources in the country. That again would be the cliff dwellings, the kivas, the granaries, the pictograph panels, and the petroglyph panels. All of that part of our national heritage, the highest density of cultural resources in the country. What you see here under Bears Ears, the area that is gray is all that remains from the original boundaries, which are now primarily all in black. Then you have Grand Staircase Escalante. An area bigger than Yosemite National Park is now at risk of industrialization. You can see again the hatched area, the grayish area is the area that still remains. So about half of the original. Now, part of the frustration in all of this were that there were a number of fallacies coming out of the White House, things that weren't quite true. And one of the comments coming out of the White House was that public lands will once again be for public use. Well, the monuments were already American-owned public lands intended for public use, shared across the entire citizenry for current and future generations. Instead, the White House opened all newly unprotected lands to coal mining, uranium extraction, and so on. So just frustrating again. There were other things that were said that weren't true. We have seen how this tragic federal overreach prevents many Native Americans from having their rightful voice over the sacred land. And that is entirely false. Bears Ears is in fact a tribal monument declared at the request of 5 sovereign tribal nations with deep ties to the land. And these sovereign tribal nations include the Navajo, Hopi, Zuni, the Ute tribe, and the Ute Mountain Ute. The original proclamation, the full boundaries, states that traditional uses of the land shall continue. So again, this is just patently untrue. I don't think it is controversial, actually. I think it's so sensible. The action, as it turns out, is remarkably controversial, unprecedented, and it immediately faced court challenges. As it turns out, this action removed protections, by definition, is the largest elimination of protections for public lands in U.S. history. U.S. legal experts overwhelmingly agree that no president has the authority to reduce monuments. And so we're in uncharted legal territory. This is where things stand right now. The Antiquities Act permits presidents to safeguard federal lands, and the Federal Lands Policy and Management Act, 1976, confirms a president can establish a monument, but not rescind or substantially reduce a site. So the outcome of these lawsuits could impact the future of all national monuments across the United States. The Secretary of Interior at the time, who has since stepped down because of ethics issues, said, this is a quote, "We also have a pretty good idea of, certainly, the oil and gas potential. Not much. So Bears Ears isn't really about oil and gas." And then, based on the Freedom of Information Act, the New York Times investigated and found Interior Department emails indicate that oil exploration was a central factor in the decision to scale back Bears Ears National Monument in Utah. I suppose much of the irony is that all of this is occurring at the same time as grave concerns over climate change.